Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Heaven Crawley. I'm Head of Equitable Development and Migration at the UN-University Center for Policy Research in New York. I'm also Director of the MIDEQ Hub. I'll be telling you more about the MIDEQ Hub shortly. And I'd like to, together with my co-editor, Joseph Tay, really very warmly welcome you to this launch of the Palgrave Handbook of South-South Migration and Inequality, an event that's being held as part of the UN Migration Network's Migration Week 2024, and a really fantastic opportunity to hear, I hope, from some of our authors about the book that we've just published. Just a little bit on the structure of the event. I'm going to give you a brief overview at the beginning, just about the kind of thinking behind the book and why we wanted to put together this collection at this particular moment in time, and also the work of the MIDEQ Hub that underpins a lot of what we've been exploring. And then I'm going to hand over to our speakers for about 10 minutes each. I'll be quite tight on the time because we have a lot of people who are going to present, and they will just give you an overview of their chapter and some of the broader issues within which their research is embedded. And then I hope at the end we'll have some time for any questions or some comments from you. You can write your comments and questions in the chat box, I believe. Just checking the functionality. Yes, in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we get a chance to pick up on those. And just for your information, the event is being recorded so that we can share it after the event with others. So, as I say, very warm welcome again to this launch of the Palgrave Handbook. Just want to start by really setting the scene for why we decided to focus on South-South migration inequality. Much of the research in the migration space, and many of us have been working in this space for a long time, focuses on migration between the global South and the global North, or between the countries of the global North. But in fact, most migration actually happens between the countries of the global South, and an estimated 70% in some cases. And you'll see from this graphic here, from Abel and Cohen's recent work, the nature of those flows and the kind of the density of flows between regions and within continents rather than between North and South. Differs by male and female, but essentially the patterns are essentially the same. And that is the reason fundamentally for why we wanted to write this book, was we thought that we needed to somehow capture the importance of the drivers and the developmental impacts of these two-way flows between countries of the global South in terms of resources, knowledge, culture, in what we define as migration corridors. So we don't see this as just being about what happens in the receiving countries for migrants or in the sending countries, but rather this very dynamic relationship between the two places. So that's the kind of starting point, if you like, of what the handbook aims to do. It really wants to highlight the importance of South-South migration, including its potential to contribute to the development process. We also would like in this handbook to explore the specificity of migration between the countries of the global South. So what we're not trying to do in the handbook is to say that there's something necessarily very particular or specific to migration in the global South, but rather to unpack what we mean by the global South, to look at the distinct histories, the economies and cultures that might influence migration in the regions, and also acknowledging that whilst there is, of course, a kind of center and periphery between North and South in terms of power and resources in particular, there are in fact multiple centers and peripheries across the global South that shape the nature of migration flows and its impacts. And in doing so, we really want to foreground the relationships between migration and inequality. Global inequalities in power and opportunity, inequalities in the right to move, intersectional inequalities based on gender, on race, on age and religion, all of which underpin migration in terms of the process, in terms of the experience, and also, of course, in terms of the outcomes. And in so doing in the book, we really want to draw in and upon the very vast wealth of expertise on migration and the context within which migration takes place in the global South, which often gets ignored or bypassed or marginalized or co-opted due to inequalities in knowledge production. in the way that funding works in terms of research, in terms of language, in terms of publication paywalls, and all of those things which make it often very difficult for Global South knowledges and perspectives to enter in the dominant discourse on migration and development. We also finally want to showcase the work of the MIDEQ Hub. And in that context, I just want to say a little bit more about the work of the MIDEQ Hub and why it is that we consider this to be such an important starting point. The MIDEQ Hub has the Migration for Development and Equality Hub, MIDEQ, unpacks the complex and multidimensional relationship between migration, inequality, and development in the context of the Global South. And we aim really to transform understanding of these relationships by decentering the production of knowledge about migration and its consequences away from the Global North towards those countries where most migration takes place. We've been funded by the UK government through the Global Challenges Fund, a very substantial amount of funding over the last 5 years. And in fact, the project is just beginning to come to an end. We're in the sort of final few months of the project. A large number of partners organized in 6 migration corridors across 12 countries and in different parts of the Global South, again, to try and really unpack and understand the complexity of South-South migration. MIDEQ's approach, and it's very much reflected in the handbook, is about decentering and decolonizing, if you like, the production of knowledge about migration, drawing on the expertise and knowledge of not just academics, but also our artists, civil society partners in the Global South, and harnessing and building not just research, but also policy and academic, artistic and other forms of capacity in those regions. We want to mainstream migration analysis into a broader understanding of development. So it's not just about migration, but how does migration relate to other broader processes of socioeconomic and political change? And in order to do that, we want to break down some of the conceptual and disciplinary silos that have typically characterized migration research. We also want to put migrants' rights and capabilities at the center of the analysis, drawing on not just legal frameworks, but a wide variety of tools to try and secure better outcomes for migrants, for their families, and for the wider communities of which they're part. And we also want to bridge the gap between policy and practice at different levels. So the objectives of the handbook essentially reflect and reinforce these broader objectives of the MIDEQ Hub. And they do that because the handbook essentially came from the work of the MIDEQ Hub, insofar as many of the contributions come from the project, but of course, lots of the thinking about why we want to shift the way in which migration research is done originate in a way from this project. So our overarching vision is to disrupt dominant assumptions about the reasons why people move, the consequences of migration, to deepen knowledge and understanding of the relationships between South-South migration, inequality, and development. And we want to do this by building this interdisciplinary migration capacity for research, challenging dominant narratives, and bringing that information, that knowledge, into contact with those who have power to make a difference in this space. I guess in some way, if you like, talking truth to power. So the Palgrave Handbook, which we're here to launch today, was published about a month ago. It's available open access thanks to the MIDEQ Hub and the funders of the project. And it's already been downloaded 44,000 times in a month. So we're very delighted that we're here today to launch it officially and also to hear from some of the speakers, from some of the contributors to the handbook. Now, the handbook draws on contributions from nearly 70 migration scholars, mostly from the Global South, many from MIDEQ. And as I say, it really challenges dominant conceptualizations of migration to offer new perspectives and insights that we hope can unlock migration's development potential. The handbook is structured in 4 parts, and just to give you a sense of those different parts, each of which really tries to take a different dimension of South-South migration, the concept of South-South migration, what we mean by the South and how migration unfolds differentially in different regions, the different kinds of inequalities that come to make a difference in the context of migration, and of course, policy and other responses to migration processes. Just to give you a feel really of what the book consists of. And we are very delighted to have, as I say, some of the speakers from some of the contributors to each of those parts here today to speak about their contributions. Huge numbers of thank yous just before we go into hearing from the speakers, all the authors and some of the sort of support team. Thank you so much for your contributions, for patiently responding to the very many emails that everyone knows is involved in the production process of this type over about 2 years. Thanks to the editorial and production teams at Palgrave and at Springer for all their work on the publication process, to the MIDEQ Hub and the funders, and to the endorsers for their positive reviews. We have some links, we can put them in the chat for you, both to the handbook itself. We'll also put up a file that gives you a code for a 20% discount on hard copies, but you can, as I say, download both the whole handbook and the individual chapters for free. So I hope you'll do so. But I think before we go into any more about the practicalities, I really wanted to hand over to, I hope, my co-editor, Professor Joseph Tay, who I'm hoping has now joined us and might be able to say a few words. Joseph, if you're there, I fear you may be not able to hear us just yet. And if not, we'll perhaps wait a little while and see if Joseph can join us later on. I do hope so. So in the meantime, let's start with, I guess, an overview of South-South migration, and it comes from Carolyn Schul. Carolyn, welcome to the event. Thank you so much for your contribution. Really appreciate it. And a really important scene setter as to, you know, some of the detail of what I've been saying about the importance of the scale of South-South migration. Carolyn is co-director of the Duke Programme on Climate-Related Migration and a lecturing fellow at the Duke Centre for International Development. Her research examines the root causes of human migration and mobility with a focus on themes of gender, youth, rural development and climate change. And today, Carolyn's going to be speaking about her chapter with Alex Debray on global trends in South-South migration. Carolyn, you've got 10 minutes. I'm going to be officious, but I'm sure you'll give us a good insight into what the overall picture is. So the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be able to meet some of the other panelists whose work I so admire. So thanks for having me. As she said, this is a chapter that I worked on with Alex Debray from Ghent University, who I'm happy to also see is present with us today. And what I want to do is just basically give you a big picture overview of global trends in South-South migration. And starting with just some basic statistics. Over 1/3 of all international migration in 2020 was between countries in the global south. So this was more than migration from the global south to the global north. Countries in the global south host at least 40% of all international migrants and over 85% of refugees and asylum seekers. From a global perspective, many of you have probably heard the statistic that around 3% of the world's total population are international migrants. And this percentage has remained relatively stable since we first started measuring it in the 1960s. But even if rates of international migration have remained surprisingly stable, there have been really important changes in the direction and the nature of migration over the last half century. And so what we dive into in this chapter is really changes in the direction of migration within different regions of the global south over the last 30 years. So the data that we use comes from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. This is really the most geographically comprehensive data set that we have available. It's not entirely satisfactory. You know, migration data is very hard to get, but it's the best that we have. And so we are presenting findings from this data set. You see here in the picture what constitutes the global south within our analysis and the different regions within that. We acknowledge, and in the handbook, it's covered extensively how problematic even it is to define the global south or to say, you know, which regions, what are the borders of different regions within it. But we had to make certain decisions. These are the regions that we look at, but we acknowledge that, you know, there's a lot that goes behind these definitions of the global south, and we should bring a critical eye to those. So here you can see the evolution of international migration stocks, the volumes of international migration, and just to see how south to south migration compares to other directions, south to north, north to south, north to north. You can see in 2020 that volumes of south to south migration were slightly higher than south to north migration. This is not always the case. It was actually the opposite in 2005, whereas in 1990, again, south to south migration was predominant. If you look at gender differences between regions, there's also, whereas south to north migration, we see roughly equal shares of male and female migration. It was quite notable that male migration within the global south tends to be much higher than female migration. This gap at least was more distinctive compared to other regions. And what we wanted to do is just to try to map what are some of the top migration corridors within the global south. So how are people moving within and across different regions? And what was quite striking is that migration from South Asia to the Middle East is now the largest migration corridor within the global south. It's seen a remarkable rise from the 1990s onwards, from 8.4 million in 1990 to over 21 million in 2020. In 1990, actually, migration from countries in South Asia to other countries in South Asia was the dominant migration corridor at that time. That would have been in first place if we were looking at 1990. But volumes of intra-regional migration within South Asia have actually declined because of this rise in migration to the Middle East. However, you can also see that after this movement from South Asia to the Middle East, the top 5 migration corridors are all regional migration corridors. So migration from countries in sub-Saharan Africa to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, likewise for the Middle East, South America, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And again, once you start to look down, you also will notice that other migration corridors tend to be, for example, from China to Southeast Asia, or from South Asia to Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa to Northern Africa, regions that border each other. We were interested in the degree to which migration stays within a region or is moving beyond it. And so here we took each region and we kind of mapped what's the share of international migration that remains within the region. So for example, from countries of sub-Saharan Africa to other countries of sub-Saharan Africa. And what's the share of migration that's outside of the region, which we're calling extra-regional. And here, those dynamics I was describing for South Asia, you can see pretty clearly. In 1990, the darkest column, you can see intra-regional was higher than extra-regional. But by 2020, you see a massive jump in extra-regional migration from South Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa has some of the highest volumes of intra-regional migration across the global south. It is worth noting, though, that there is a jump in extra-regional migration that's also occurring from sub-Saharan Africa. And we were also struck by the fact that there are certain regions, Central America, Northern Africa, Central Asia, where, contrary to this idea that most migration is regional, we see in these very specific regions that actually most international migration is extra-regional or outside of the region. Of course, Central America, Northern Africa, Central Asia, these border wealthier regions of the global north, North America, Europe, Russia, and of small islands face a different sort of geographic reason for seeing more extra-regional migration. But this is worth noting because in some ways, I think, for example, migration research and discourse in the US is very shaped by dynamics from Central America to the US. And what we see from this particular region sometimes can be generalized more broadly. And so it gives the impression that, there's this mass extra-regional migration taking place, which might overshadow the degree to which there really is significant regional movements within the global south, and we need to be paying more attention to that. So Big picture trends, most international migrants leaving the global south move to countries within their home region, particularly in areas like sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South America. Exceptions to this trend are regions of the global south that neighbor wealthier countries of the global north, Central America, North Africa, Central Asia. In these places, extra-regional south-north migration is far more common. But even from areas with high rates of inter-regional migration, we also see extra-regional migration is on the rise as more international migrants are traveling further distances. And in this regard, the Middle East is a relatively new within the last 30 years, at least within our analysis, and major migration destination within the global south. So migration from South Asia to the Middle East is quite striking and is now the largest south-south migration corridor in the world. The implications for migration governance are that we need to be thinking at multiple levels, and we need to be thinking at the regional level because different regions show different trends. So because in most places migrants to the global south move regionally, there's a need to really strengthen regional cooperation on migration governance. Many countries across the global south are already trying to do this, usually within the framework of regional economic communities. So ECOWAS in West Africa, the Southern Common Market in South America. But because we do see this rise in extra-regional movements, we really need complementary international frameworks. And of course, this is the aspiration of the Global Compact on Migration. That compact is non-binding, but it does begin to sketch the contours of what global cooperation around international migration could look like. And that document is also setting the scene for many of the conversations that are happening as part of the UN Migration Week, of which this book launch is a part. And just to conclude, I think I'm right at time, just a cautionary note about some of these numbers. You know, capturing international migration is exceedingly difficult. We want flow data, we have stock data. Stock data usually undercounts population mobility. So the figures that we present here likely underestimate the real extent of migration that's occurring in the global south. And some important trends that are covered in the handbook, like migration between Africa and China, are simply not reflected in the data set that we used here. So looking forward, if we really want to better understand South migration, we need more investment and data collection around it, whether that's through censuses or surveys, but we also need more detailed case studies. And that's really what we get in the chapters of the handbook. And I'm quite happy to pass it on to other authors to kind of give us more grounded perspectives. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carolyn. Perfectly timed as my alarm went off. So really appreciate the overview. I think the chapter is a really important sort of scene setter in terms of us getting a grasp of this complexity, as you say, breaking down these kind of generalizations that tend to dominate some of the discourse. So it's a really appreciated chapter. Thank you so much for your contribution and for your presentation. Much appreciated. Delighted to say that Joseph Tay, the co-editor of the handbook, has now been able to join us. Joseph, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Did you want to just say a few words before we move on to the other contributions about the handbook and about, of course, the importance of these global South perspectives on migration?
Yes.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you so much, Heavy. United Nations Network on Migration. UKRI officials. Palgrave Macmillan officers. Co-editor, Professor Evan Clory. MIDEQ executive. MIDEQ co-directors, co-authors. I am very happy to be with you on this occasion and to be invited to share my few thoughts. Thank you so much, all of you. Let me join the co-editor, Heaven Glory, to thank all of you for honoring our invitation to be part of this book launch. I also want to join Heaven to re-emphasize again the importance of this book to us as a MIDEQ network and also as migration researchers. As has already been said, even though a majority of migrants from the global south tend to move to another destination within their region, we have very few books on South migration. What we know about migration in the global south tend to come from political and media narratives. And this tend to portray exodus from the global south, which is not the real case. So for us in the global south, this book is extremely important and also timely because it is going to be a handbook for people researching on the global south. People will no more depend on unscientific media narratives. That they are going to depend on data that have been provided by different scholars. Another reason why the book is important for those of us in the global south is it has provided opportunity for early career researchers to work with established researchers when writing is concerned. For one reason why we have very few books on the global south is that apart from the fact that the publishers are largely in the global north, most of the migration scholars that are established are also in the global north. Though we have some established migration scholars in the global south also. It becomes difficult for early career researchers in the global south to publish their works. And so this book provided the opportunity for early career researchers to work with established one. The fact they were able to work together and they receive comments and they address those comments means it's a part of capacity building, something that we think will be useful in future book projects. The book has some unique features which makes it different from existing books. Some of them have been highlighted already implicitly. I will mention a few of them. The first one, which we need to remember, whether we have already bought the book or not, is regionalism. It has just been presented that majority of the people are moving within their region. When you talk of the global south, in some places it's 70%, In other places, it's 60%. In some places, it's 50%. The lowest you can talk of will be 50%. And even the lowest that you are talking of as 50%, you can count them in other regions. So in this book, we have talked about some regional migrations. For instance, we have migration from Burkina Faso to Cote d'Ivoire, which is one of the biggest corridors in the entire world. We also have migration from Haiti to Brazil, which is another region that is of interest to many scholars. So the regionalism is one important feature of the book. The second thing that is important of the book is its use of theory. We have been told that there are several migration theories, and these migration theories are presented in some other textbooks as if they work individually. In this book, if you use this book, you come across several theories. And then by the time you finish reading, you will see the way different theories work. So for early career researchers and students, the use of this book will enhance their capacity to combine empirical findings with theoretical reflections. This is something that is difficult for many people. So that is one thing. The other thing has been highlighted implicitly. We combine patterns also with policy issues and development issues. That makes the book very important. So throughout the book, the policy implications of findings have been emphasized. And that is something that is good, which will be very good for governments and development practitioners. So I think that is also another area where the book is very unique. So all in all, I would just say the book is very good, especially for those of us in the global south. The book can be used for development planning, policies, and other things. And even people in the global north can also use it for similar purposes. Since sometimes some institutions and organizations are developing policies and programs for the global south where they work. So all in all, I would say it is a useful book, which is highly recommended. It can be used by students, it can be used by teachers, it can be used by lecturers, development practitioners, government officials can use them. All these people can use them. Before I end, I would like to once again thank all the co-authors. There are a lot of book projects that are failing in the world because the co-authors have not responded to comments that have been sent to them. When we started, we thought this was very ambitious, but the co-authors were very responsive. So I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you. I also want to thank my very good friend and co-editor who led the entire process from proposal writing to completion, Professor Evan Clovey. It's just a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We really appreciate your comments and also you making the time to join us today. It's very, very nice to hear you. Thank you, Joseph. So yes, I think Joseph's given a very clear overview of the kind of benefits of the book. You'll see in the chat a link to the book that can be downloaded free, as I said earlier, but also the discount code if you wish to purchase a hard copy or encourage your libraries to do so. Let's move on with the program now. I'd like to hand over the screen to my dear colleague, Dereji Faisa, who's a co-I for MIDEQ, working in the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor, also an associate professor at the College of Law and Governance in Addis Ababa University. Dereji, very much a pleasure to have you with us today. We were talking, or Joseph was mentioning about the contribution that this volume makes to theory and challenging some of the dominant migration theories. I know you're going to talk today about your chapter with your co-authors on migration as a collective project. So the screen is yours. You have 10 minutes. Look forward to hearing more about your chapter.
Thank you, Heaven, and greeting to everyone. Yes, our chapter is entitled Migration as a Collective Project, and it is written by Meron Zellaka, Fana Gebresambadi, and myself. And basically, it's about how to bring collective dimensions of migration into focus. And we consider that this is an important knowledge gap because in existing theories, the main thrust is very individualist. And this is not by accident. It has something to do with inequalities in knowledge production. And most of the knowledge produced in migration studies is made in and made by North and Northerners. And the frames which have been used to make sense of migration processes, including in the global North, have often come from there. So it's this emphasis that we want to challenge, that there is also a collective dimension of migration. It's not just simply about rational choice and individuals and things of that nature. And we, in order to demonstrate this, why and how collectivity matters in migration processes, we have used a case study, and this is Hadiyah migration to South Africa, which is our corridor. And there you find the Hadiyah people as the majority of Ethiopian migrants in South Africa. And even the very fact that there is this dominance of certain group of people in or geographic concentration of migrants has something to do with the collective nature of migration itself, and how and why this is so helps us bring in this, as I said, this collective dimension. And we try to substantiate our argument how and why collectivity matters in migration process in the Global South. We have used 4 ethnographic evidences and different moments of these migration processes to illustrate how this occurs. The first one is spirituality of migration, which is a very, very important feature in our corridor, especially among the Hadiyah. This is expressed in the form of prophecies and prayers and gospel songs, and to what extent this really inform decision-making and even generate or build capacities. But these processes have also a very strong collective component. For instance, there is a foundational prophecy in the onset of Hadiyah migration to South Africa. And this prophecy is not individual prophecy, but a prophecy which is delivered to the Hadiyah as a people, and to what extent they consider their migration and their predominance in South Africa as a prophecy fulfilled. In short, migration is construed in the form of enacting a divine script. And then this kind of things came about as in their own self-understanding at the vanguard of evangelical Christianity in southern Ethiopia, and how this has played out in this covenantal relationship between Hadiyah as a people and God, as it were. And without taking this lens into account, you wouldn't really understand, this some important dynamics in the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor. Second, evidence for collective dimension of migration in our corridor is to what extent the migration project is also expressed in the form of an elite-managed historical project of catching up. Here you find Hadia ambassadors or government officials or elites more broadly featuring as migration intermediaries. In so doing, they are articulating the aspiration of their people. They don't have to do that unless there is a reason to that, unless they also bring these collective dimensions so seriously. And a lot has been said and written, for instance, the role of the Ethiopian ambassador to South Africa and how he really actively contributed for these migration processes. And in both cases, in the spirituality of migration and then the role of elites as in migration intermediaries, we try to historicize these current practices. And in so doing, we situated into broader historical and social context, and there you find migration as part of wider processes of social change. And this has a lot to do with to what extent current social inequalities are historically constructed. You know, Hadia, Southern Ethiopia more broadly, they are considered as Ethiopia's periphery. There is inequality in terms of regional inequality within Ethiopia. And there you find migration playing a very important equalizing role. And then, you know, why we are interested in the spirituality of migration is not just, you know, because the idea are engaged in, some imaginaries about life after, but it's about the here and now, and then to what extent religion provides a space for collective agency, how they build capability, and even to what extent aspiration has also a collective dimension. And it is true that, within a space of 2 decades, even less than 2 decades, you find the Hadia really catching up with mainstream and dominant Ethiopian society. Migration plays a very, very important role in bridging this inequality. We have also discussed the role of social networks in building not only individual, but also collective capabilities. There we found out social remittances, not just the usual way of from destination to origin places, but the other way around. To what extent institutions also travel from places of origin to destination, and particularly these saving associations, and then their role in the success of Hadia businesses in South Africa. Without that culture of saving, without that important institutions, you wouldn't find the Hadia where they are, as an important migration population in South Africa. But we are not making this kind of a one-sided argument that migration is all about collectivities. And of course, there is individual dimension. And for that, we brought in a temporal perspective. To what extent the Hadia migration project have moved within a continuum between the collective and the individual, and what happens when a certain migration project, which started as predominantly a collective project, gets individualized in the context of new social and economic experiences in the situation of the diaspora in the migration, and the accumulation of material wealth and the associated greed, and the implications of that as well. And currently, there is a very strong individualist turn and materialist turn in Hadia migration project, and this has played out in terms of social fragmentation, competition, and even a very increasing homicide rate among the Hadia. And there again, it's very interesting to what extent the Hadia make sense of their existence as migrants in South Africa, and the deterioration of their situation, also from a spiritual lens, but also from a collective point of view. And then they said it's no longer a gift by God, but it is turning fast into a curse. And they take individual responsibility for that. And for some, it's inducing a return migration, and others are also engaging with spiritual resources to regain that collective dimension. So we are not buying two binaries, collective versus individual. It's both, but it varies over time, and that's what we try to capture in our chapter in this book. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Deriji. It's a really fascinating contribution on the back of what I know is a really interesting piece of work that you've been undertaking as part of the MIDEQ Hub, and really appreciate both the contribution and your presentation on that. So thank you, and to your colleagues, of course. We've heard from a very particular corridor, the Ethiopia-South Africa one. I want to turn now to another contribution in the book that looks at the regional perspective that we've been hearing a little bit about so far in this launch event. Jisha Liu is a professor at the College of Humanities and Development Studies at the China Agricultural University in Beijing, also one of our MIDEQ co-investigators. And Jisha's research has focused on China and international development, South-South migration, and inequality, and she's published very widely on these issues. Jisha, we're very happy to have you with us today. I know you'll be speaking about your chapter with Joseph Tay and with Gordon Crawford on migration from China to Ghana, and we're really interested to hear from you about this regional movement between the regions of the Global South that perhaps is even less covered than some other types. So Jisha, the screen is yours. You've got 10 minutes to tell us about your chapter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Heaven, and greetings to everyone. So firstly, I would like to congratulate to Heaven, Joseph, and all the authors, contributors to the publication of the handbook. So as you know, the migration between China and African countries, in fact, is a two-way flow. Our chapter number 15, named Inter-Regional Migration in the Global South, Chinese Migrants in Ghana, in this handbook is about the migration in the China-Ghana corridor. And it is a kind of sketch of Chinese migrants in Ghana. So the chapter is co-authored by Professor Joseph from University of Ghana and Professor Gordon Crawford from Coventry University and I. So I'm very grateful to be here and share the importance of this chapter. So Chinese presence in Africa has been for many centuries, with the rise and fall in numbers at particular historical periods. Since the beginning of the 21st century, so Chinese migration to Africa has become increasingly significant, and at the same time, this has received attention in the literature, in the media, in recent times. So while there is little understanding of the drivers and impacts of this migration, so our chapter is examining the drivers and impacts of Chinese migration to Ghana, where has been a significant destination for Chinese migrants for several decades. So in the 21st century, the number of Chinese non-resident migrant workers has increased in Ghana, associated with the large-scale government-to-government infrastructure projects that has been undertaken, such as the construction of roads, the Bay Dam, and the football stadium for the Africa Cup of Nations tournament in 2008. However, such migration was usually short-term and regulated. It is reported that the number of Chinese migrants in Ghana have increased substantially since 2004, including the increased number of irregular migrants. Especially for the Chinese gold miners, migrants in Ghana actually emerged since 2006 and went to the peak in 2013. Of course, after 2013, the crackdown caused the decline of the numbers of the Chinese gold miners, and also the numbers changed quite dramatically actually afterwards. So in 2018, the number of Chinese in Ghana was reported to reach 30,000 already. So it is revealed that the Chinese in Ghana work in several sectors, actually, including wholesale and retail trade, construction, manufacturing, mining, education and healthcare activities, and agriculture. Of course, from the media, I think it is more apparent the gold miners were seen more than the other engagement. So this chapter is based on primary data we have collected in the fieldwork, as well as the review of relevant literature, and consists of 5 sections. The first part is a brief description of the Chinese migrants in Ghana. And the second part is to discuss the drivers of Chinese migration to Ghana. And the third and the fourth part is trying to unpack the impacts of Chinese migration in Ghana and in China. And finally, we give the main conclusion in the last part. So on the whole, in the chapter, we have demonstrated that migration flows from China to Ghana are driven by an interaction of underlying precipitating, proximate, and mediating factors. For instance, structural inequalities between the two countries provide a context for the flow of Chinese government financial grants, which facilitate the migration of skilled and unskilled migrants to Ghana. High cost of living in China and limited opportunities for upward social and economic mobility are the second drivers. And also high profit margins, especially in the small-scale gold mining and trade sectors, attract Chinese migrants to Ghana because these factors provide opportunities and possibilities for them to have the better social mobility. So the migration of Chinese people to Ghana has both positive and negative impacts. In the mining sector, Chinese migrants have introduced new equipment and technologies to Ghana. Positively, it's observed both Ghanaians and Chinese miners have improved their incomes and livelihoods. And also it can be seen in Ghana a spillover effect into the wider local economy that serves the small-scale miners. Yet, not all can benefit equally in the mining and trade activities. So those who own more capitals and engage in the mining or trade activities earlier actually benefit more than the others who engage later, and those employees. And those Ghanaians earned more when they cooperated with the Chinese migrants, and those who have no resources earn less. Even some of the Ghanaians are employed by the employers. Also, to some extent, negative impacts can be found, including great environmental degradation of both water bodies and land, and the loss of agricultural land production. And also the question of the local citizens on the legitimacy of the state, given the evidence of state collusion in unlawful activities and its hypocrisy in undertaking a military-style crackdown in a selective manner. Also, the wealth gap between the Chinese migrants' families in the origin communities can be observed, together with the increasing income of the migrant families. Also, migration and working in illegal mines in Ghana are also associated with a number of psychological and health problems that continue to affect returned migrants. So in this chapter, we have given a lot of key points of the Chinese migrants in Ghana, especially in the mining sectors and the trade sectors. So welcome you to see the details with a lot of quotes and examples, cases and the data in this chapter, and respond to their comments and suggestions for us for future studies. Thank you very much. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Jisha, both for the contribution, the excellent chapter, but also for your presentation. And I think the chapter really, well, firstly, draws our attention to broader processes, I guess, of Chinese migration, not just to Ghana, but other parts of Africa too, of course. And it really shows the intersection, I think, of migration with these broader development processes and these centers of peripheries within the global south. So I think it's a really important contribution to the handbook, and very grateful for for you for making it. So thank you so much, indeed. We're going to move now to another regional migration, this time between Africa and South America. I'm very delighted to welcome to the event Luisa Feline Freire and Leon Luca Oba, the authors of the chapters, co-authors of the chapter. Luisa Feline Freire is an associate professor of political science and international at the International Development Research Center, research chair on forced displacement in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Leon is a teaching assistant at the Department of Political Science in Lima in Peru. And both have contributed with their colleague to this excellent chapter on interregional migration in the global South, African migration to Latin America. And delighted to have you both with us. And the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heaven, really, for the organization, for putting together this great volume. And this chapter is especially dear to my heart because this is really the topic I wanted to look at for my PhD some 20 years ago when I first thought about what to do. And in the end, I went more towards the direction of policy liberalization. But really, this issue of African migration to Latin America has been close to my heart for a long time, and it's very hard to study. And this is like one of the things we'll be talking about today, why it's important and why it is hard to study. Leon, if you want to continue with the next slide. So why should we study African migration to Latin America? And here we really have to understand the regional context if we think about policy relevance. So when I was living in Argentina some 20 years ago, I saw African migrants in the streets, and I saw that they were recently arrived people. You could sense this. They were not Afro-Argentines. And back then, the phenomena actually caused and created some political interest in the region because it was a phenomenon that was new. There was a stark increase in numbers. So it was very, very interesting how that caused quite a bit of concern, even though overall numbers were still low. So I back then spoke to some policymakers in Argentina, but also in Ecuador and later in Brazil. And there was quite some concern for this new extra-continental immigration. That has changed with the Venezuelan displacement crisis. So no one is talking about African or Asian extra-continental migration towards the region right now in policy circles. Nevertheless, and Leon will present the data we were able to collect and also talk about some of the difficulties, there is a stark increase. It is a relatively new phenomenon. So really here as academics, we have the opportunity to study pioneer migration, not only across borders, but across continents in the global South. And at the same time, there is a vast geographical and cultural distance traveled. And in terms of migrant characteristics, this is not one group of people, right? These are different flows from both West and East Africa with a huge variety of characteristics, of capabilities, of different aspirations. So it's really this living laboratory, if you so want. At the same time, we believe that these flows really help us to refute very stark push-pull models precisely between countries in the global South towards countries in the global North. With African migrants fleeing poverty, demographic pressure, violent conflict. We know that literature. It's way more complex. And really what we see are aspirations that have to do with family reunification, very often in North America, with work, with education, with personal aspirations, but also situations of flight, where sometimes reaching the European Union has become so difficult that sometimes for some people it has been more easy to get a visa for Brazil, or in the case of Ecuador, in the time of visa freedom to reach Ecuador as a safe haven. At the same time, if you want to go back once more, I'll try to, I have to hurry, I know. At the same time, Latin America has some of the most liberal policies in the world. So it's also really this opportunity to study the effect of the liberalization of visa and immigration regimes in the global South on South-South flows. Thanks, Leon. So we can continue. in terms of inequality, the other big topic of the handbook, we have to consider a couple of things. So on the one hand side, I just spoke about the liberalization of immigration regimes, but we also see an ongoing securitarization of migration, both in the context of Venezuelan mass displacement in South America, and also and specifically in the context of US-Mexican relations. We also see a huge gap between these liberal laws and the lack of implementation and practice. And especially if we think of non-discrimination, of special protection, of, and in the case of some, and again, I'm grouping them together now because we only have 10 minutes, but some of the groups of African migrants who do not speak the language, very different socioeconomic, educational levels, but many states and bureaucracies in South America simply do not have the capacities to do what they claim they would be doing in terms of non-discrimination and special protection in their laws. And last but not least, those of you who know Latin America know that that racism is deeply enshrined in all of the countries in the region. And very often, although there is this talk of being colorblind, of not being racist, that looks quite different in practice, both in the political sphere and in daily social interactions. So with that, I hand over to Leon, who's going to tell us a little bit about how we tried to get close to a proxy of what's going on in terms of flows. So over to you, Leon. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Feline. Well, how can we map the trend in African migration flows to Latin America? And we tried to track these trends based on two proxies, the UNHCR data on African asylum seekers and refugees, and the second one is the apprehension data on African nationals in Mexico, from those migrants who tried to reach the US. And about the first one, asylum seekers numbers, although these data don't allow us to measure the overall number of migrants, they likely mirror trends in African migration, both origin and destination countries, and also both African in need of international protection and economic migrants tend to file asylum claims to regularize their migrant situations, no? And about the refugees, this data allow us to measure or to track which nationalities are granted protection and are likely to form communities in the host countries now. And about the apprehension data in Mexico, this data indicate which nationalities tend to transmigrate towards North America and mainly the USA. Well, as you can see in the figure, in the first figure, the stark increase of African asylum seekers from 2012 to 2022. In 2015, African asylum seekers represented more than 30% of all pending asylum claims in the region, who led to a lot of political concerns. But the percentage and political salience subsided with the Venezuelan displacement crisis since 2015. And it's important to highlight that 6 million Venezuelans were displaced and over 700,000 asylum seekers until 2023, no? Even though numbers of pending African asylum seekers claims are at historic height. Well, in the second figure, the main host countries of both African asylum seekers and refugees in Latin America are Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, with Brazil standing out with a higher number of asylum seekers from West and Central Africa and refugees from Southern Africa. And about mapping African migrants detained in the US-Mexican border, as Yates and Bolter point out, in fiscal year 2019, Mexico made 9 times as many more detention of African migrants than in 2014, while in Europe, the number of arrests decreased by half for the same period. And according to official Mexican migration statistics, as you can see in the first figure, in the last 15 years, the number of detention of African migrants varied with an upward trend until 2019, when it reached a peak of irregular African migrants detained. Despite the sharp drop in the number of apprehension of Africans in 2020 due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2022, the number of Africans apprehended in the U.S. further increased.
Are you still there?
I think we might have lost Leon.
I was thinking the same. Do you want to pick up the points he was making, Feline?
Yes, so what he was just saying was that after, so we see this drop, most likely due to COVID-19. I'm just opening the presentation as well, to see the last slide on my computer. And then, where are we now? Yeah. But then, like, again, so that doesn't mean, as we know, all over the world, COVID, you know, had like a maybe a freining effect to some of these flows, but certainly did not stop them. And then I'm not going to share the presentation now because we're almost done. What the last figure just showed the top 10 nationalities of irregular African migrants detained by Mexico. And those were Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also Senegalese, Cameroonians, Angolans, Ghanaians, and Somalis. So I think that just drives home the point I was making earlier. Of course, African migration to Latin America and onwards migration to North America is not one flow. There are many. And maybe last but not least, what we know in terms of motivations, that they're very, very varied. So some people come to stay in South America, especially in Brazil and Argentina, and then others really use the region as a gateway towards North America. There, Leon is back. But I think with that, we can close and hand the mic back over to Heaven. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Feline, and thank you, Leon. I'm sorry we lost you, but we really appreciate the presentation. It was very clear, and I think what it's, you know, what all three of your presentations from Jaraji, from Jisha, and Feline and Leon have shown is this complexity of South-South migration, that it's not just about South-North or the kind of homogeneity of those regions, but actually there's huge diversity in the nature of flows, in where flows are taking place, how they're changing over time, and also, of course, the implications, not just for migrants, but for the regions where people are moving to. So thanks to all of the speakers for highlighting those differences in the nature of South-South migration flows. We're going to turn now to three further speakers. I did suggest that you put your comments or questions in the chat. We're just working out how to make that happen. So bear with us on that. But let's move to three presentations that really are picking up on some of the themes in the second part of the handbook. The first presentation will be on remittances, then we have one on climate-related mobility, and then one on migration governance in the Asian context. To give you, again, just a little flavor of the huge diversity of chapters. We have 33 chapters altogether in the handbook, as I say, with 70 scholars. So there's a lot of richness of material in there, and what we want to do today is really just to give you a sense of that richness in the presentations, but there's much more, of course, for you to explore. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tebieka Alexandra Tapsoba. Alexandra, nice to see you and have you with us today. Alexandra is a researcher with the MIDEQ Hub. She is based in Burkina Faso and has a PhD in development economics. Her research focuses on migration and remittances and climate change. And I think, Alexandra, you're going to tell us today about your chapter with Edward Adesiedu and Stephen Gelb on migrant resource flows and development in the global south. You have 10 minutes and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Heaven, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again, Heaven and Joseph, for the excellent work, and congratulations again to all of the authors. So our chapter is on migrant resource flows and development in the Global South. So co-written with Dr. Asidu Edward and Dr. Stephen Gelb. So the idea of this chapter was to present three types of resource flows in the Global South, namely the flows of remittances and diaspora investment, flows of goods and services, and also knowledge flows relating to skill development, production and organizational technology for enterprises. But for the sake of time, and as Evan was saying, I will focus on the remittances part of the chapter and give you an insight of these flows in the Global South, and also invite you, if it's not already done, to check the rest of the chapter to have an idea of what's going on when it comes to trade and the flows of ideas. So to begin, as a lot of the panelists already said, South-South migration is very much underestimated. So until today, if you type the word migration in a research bar, that will lead you to articles on African migrants dying in the Mediterranean Sea, or Middle Eastern citizens trying to reach Great Britain and stuff, and also now you will see what African migrants trying to reach the US via the Southern American countries. So this somehow kind of negative image of migration is just the tip of the iceberg. As we all know, and as the first panelist said, that most international migrations occur between South-South countries and even more regionally. And when it comes to remittances, things are actually the same. So remittances between South-South countries are very much underestimated. And this underestimation comes from the fact that remittances sent through formal channels, they are the only one recorded. So according to the African Development Bank and other authors as well, transfers sent through informal channels could even be as 50% greater than remittances recorded by the IMF. And surveys and censuses in developing countries, like including living standard measurement studies in Burkina Faso or Nigeria, but also the MIDEQ data, show that hand-to-hand transfers are sometimes preferred by migrants. So migrants will give, money to another migrant that is going back home to visit, some money for his family, and the migrant will also carry some money for his family when he's going back home. And another informal channel is also is what we call it's called fax in many countries, or hawala in the case of Ethiopia, which consists of money exchangers gathering the funds of multiple persons and redistributing them to the beneficiaries in the origin country via a counterpart trader in the origin country. So it is important to note that if these informal channels persist until today because of high commissions of money transfers. And that leads me to a major point that we made in the chapter, is that the cost of transfers and the cost of remittances are very high when it comes to South-South migration. And as we all know as well, so the 10.C of the SDGs aims to reduce to less than the transaction migrant remittances higher than 5%. So, however, South-South transfers costs exceeds by far the 3% and the 5%, and they are sometimes even excessive. So, generally, the South-South remittances costs are higher than the North-South remittances. So we gave some examples in the chapter. So, for example, sending money from Angola to Namibia will cost you, when using bank transfers, for example, 22. Thank you. So sending money from Angola to Namibia will cost you up to 22.4%. From South Africa to Zambia will be 18%. And in comparison, sending money from Russia to Central Asian countries only cost between 1.3 and 1.7%, according to the World Bank in 2019. So of the 30 highest cost corridors of receiving remittances in 2015, 33% were South-South corridors, and they were all in Africa, according to the World Bank in 2016. So it is these costs are high, but we wanted to also make the point that there are some initiatives that are lowering actually these costs, and there are, for example, the rise of mobile money transfers that reduce these transfer costs considerably. For example, in the West African Economic Monetary Union, countries sharing the same telephone operators, the costs are derisory. So transferring money between Senegal and another African country, sharing the same telephone operator, sometimes costs a maximum of 1% sometimes. And also in the case of Kenya, an author Mumina in 2018 shows that between 2010 and 2014, receiving money via mobile transfer cost an average of 1.93%. By contrast, bank transfers remain high, with an average of 19%. So generally speaking, money transfers via mobile phones like M-Pesa in Kenya, Orange Money or Move Money in West Africa, that help transfers and also remittances reach remote areas where generally origin households are, securely, rapidly, and also increase the use of formal channels rather than informal channels. So given the fact that we don't really have a picture of what's going on between South-South remittances, so we try to measure them, taking the example of Burkina Faso. So the data that exists on South-South remittances, they are usually estimations using variables like the stock of migrants in the destination country and also GDP per capita in the destination country. They are estimations. So what we try to do in the chapter is to use, it's a partial data, but it kind of gives a picture of what's going on. We use the La Poste office data in Burkina Faso to try and estimate the share of South-South remittances in the country. So we have been able to find that between 2019 and 2020, 33.59% of transfers received were from the South, of which 53.9% comes from Côte d'Ivoire, which is the main destination of Burkinabe migrants. So the numbers are non-negligible, but they only capture a part of the story. And as it's the only source of information that we use, and as I was saying, it only captures what's going on in the formal transfers like Western Union and stuff like that. So when we know the importance of remittances for development, it is important to measure them properly. So we also know that today remittances exceed official development aid, it exceeds foreign direct investment, and they are main source of countries' growth. And remittances they are also used by households to cope against different shocks. For example, where we have been able to find in 2021, using actually the MIDEQ data, that remittances between between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso help the household cope with the negative impacts of COVID-19 on their income. So it's a very important source of development, an important source for origin countries. So it is therefore essential, first of all, to reduce their costs. And second of all, to measure them properly, to be able to know that these are the amount that are circulating between the South and leverage them for the development of the country. So I will stop there, and thank you very much, Heaven.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I think, yeah, as you say, it's a very complicated picture, and what we're trying to do through MIDEQ, and I know many other global South scholars are trying to do as well, is to try and build up these layers of other information from different sources. And methodologically, I think there's some really innovative work in the handbook, and I think your chapter proves a very good example of that. So it provides a good example. So thank you for your presentation, really appreciate it. And of course, for the chapter itself as well, which I think is a very important contribution. We're moving on now to a further presentation, this time on the issue of climate-related mobility. You'll have gathered from the presentations that a lot of what the handbook tries to do is to try and challenge some of the dominant discourses and narratives and theoretical underpinnings of discussions on migration. And it does so very much from the perspective from the Global South. And I think our next presentation is another example of that. I'd like to warmly welcome Ingrid Boas to join us today. Ingrid is an associate professor and research coordinator of the Environmental Policy Group of Wageningen University in the Faculty of Social Science, and she works very much on this intersection of environmental mobility in a range of different contexts. And her chapter with Animesh Gautam and Ademola Eyewolo very much uses these examples to illustrate the complexity of these relationships. So really delighted to have your chapter, Ingrid, and very happy to welcome you. The screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share screen. You can see the presentation now, right?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So together with Animesh and Ademola, I've written this chapter in the handbook on climate change and human mobility in the Global South. The invitation to write this chapter was also very welcoming, as we just started a new project on trying to give more nuance to the relation between climate change and human mobility in borderland contexts, and in which we look in a different context within West Africa, the Pacific, and also South Asia. So it was also nice for us as a team to engage on that now via this chapter. So first, maybe to start off in the chapter, we start off with a short recap of the debate. So I'll do that here as well, trying to summarize a lot of the literature that's already on there, showing that the relations between climate change and human migration, which in the chapter I refer to as mobility, because we see many different ways in which people move in response to climate change, or sometimes not move, not wanting to move. So mobility and immobility shows this more wider range of movement than so much maybe the term migration suggests. And a lot of literature has shown how decisions to move or stay are shaped not just by environmental events or climatic changes, but have a wider embedding within societal factors and economic decision making, or particular histories that fit a particular context as to how and where people move, the type of networks people are in, also gender norms, of course, as sometimes often research sees that the male members of the family move first and more of the females stay, and often also sometimes leading to more dangerous situations. For instance, when there's a flood and there are cyclone shelters, there are also gender complexities at play, and women may not feel safe in these shelters, but at the same time maybe not be able to swim and getting into higher risk. So a lot of the literature looks into these different dynamics, which results in a quite plurality of ways in which people move or not move in response to climate risk. So we lay out this discussion. Also, most of the research on climate change and mobility is actually on the Global South, and there are a lot of case studies especially. And interestingly, there's very little research that for instance, examines the relation between climate change and human mobility in areas of the global north, like for instance in Europe. which is partly so, of course, because of higher vulnerabilities within the global south due to climate change or less resources to be able to adapt. But it's also because there's still this stereotypical sort of image of the climate migrant, assuming that it's poorer communities in the global south and that everybody will move to the global north. So often still the debates on climate change and migration tend to have that sort of stereotypical imagining, though a lot of research has been trying to nuance that and complex that image. But that's still what often the discussion is about, not so much within academia, but more on policy levels, and especially within media, with these images of large-scale movements of people going into the same direction, south-north type of movements. Whilst often we see that most mobility in the context of climate change is on local or regional scales. People don't per se want to leave their homes. A lot of people feel very attached to their places, which is the same, for instance, if it would happen in any country in the world. Also, for instance, if it would happen here in the Netherlands, I would also try and fight to keep my place and not simply give it up. So in the book, in the chapter, we're trying to nuance these discussions and through examples and literature coming from the global south. So the first point we make is more about the political nature of the relations between climate change and human mobility. Mainly we give attention to how there is increasingly resistance within different regions of the global south against sometimes somewhat top-down imposed narratives of regions becoming uninhabitable, of particular places that always come in the news, like Bangladesh or other places, as the hotspot of future mass climate migration or climate refugees, without this necessarily connecting with the perspectives and the experiences of the people living there. And not that people are not concerned about climate change, of course they are, and they are also very concerned about how this impacts their livelihoods and their homes. However, they want to have the right to self-determine their climate adaptation futures and ways forward, and not to be stuck within a particular narrative that has been created by media, international organizations, donors. So we give attention to this via different examples within the chapter. One most sort of telling example is from Pacific Island states, like for instance in Tuvalu, which are very low-lying and therefore very vulnerable to sea level rise and storms and floods, etc. However, that is also often how the only way in which they're being depicted, and often being depicted as a victim and as the first world climate refugees. And this sometimes goes as far that donors, financial donors, don't want to invest in adaptation in place within these islands, whilst governments, etc., have ideas to adapt also in place and to save their culture and their islands. And that the donors sort of prefer that people relocate and think of such ways. And that is what people are protesting against. There are the Pacific Climate Warriors, which is an activist group, for instance, who are often showing that we're not drowning, we're fighting, to show that they actually have a lot of also ideas about maybe how to adapt, which could involve also moving to other places, but it could also involve staying, heightening islands, protecting it in different ways. And they're trying to voice that and want to be heard, and at the same time also thinking of actions to make large polluters reduce their emissions. So we show that this is not only in Tuvalu, but the Pacific Islanders, they are very well organized in activism. So it's a good example maybe to show how it's also about questions of justice, about who decides who can move and where to move and how to adapt. So that's what we're trying to show. Another element in the chapter is about cross-border mobilities within the Global South. As I just mentioned, that a lot of the literature is about showing that the relation between climate change and human mobility is often local, often from, for instance, rural areas to a city nearby, so often within a country, or the discussion within media is from the Global South to the Global North. But what about cross-border mobilities within the Global South? As there are also many, for instance, highly nomadic groups in many areas, like pastoralist groups, but also nomadic fishery groups, or areas such as the border between Bangladesh and India, which actually used to be one area, but then after colonial times got split into two different states. And we're also trying to reflect critically on this concept of borders and nation states and Eurocentric understandings, basically, of the world order, and how to think about it more openly, or what the problems are related to such a world order, and how that impacts on the different adaptation strategies that people have, as several of these adaptation strategies to climate risk also involve moving, for instance, as pastoralists move in relation to environmental impacts, but are often prohibited increasingly to do so because of, for instance, border controls or particular discourses that pastoralists harm the environment. So this then complicates their abilities to adapt through mobility. So we're also trying to showcase that. And we conclude with 3 lessons. First of all, to avoid an environmental determinism, so to look more broadly as to what cultural, social, economic, and political factors shape decisions and possibilities to move or stay, and how that then influence people's ability to adapt to climate risk through either staying in place or moving to another area. Also look critically at these established structures such as borders and states, the role of donor funds, etc., that shape present-day climate mobilities and immobilities. And third, enable affected populations to self-determine their climate mobility futures and generally decision-making within climate change adaptation, and avoid that organizations, media, scientists come in with outsider perspectives and impose that on others. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ingrid, for what is a really important chapter, and of course, a really interesting contribution to this discussion about narrative, because as you say, much of the focus of migration research is on the north, and yet when it comes to climate-related mobility, we see this emphasis on the south, and in particular this stereotype of, or this imagining of the global south migrant, which is a very particular one and reinforces and reflects other kinds of narrative forms as well, of course. So very interesting. Thank you so much. We have one final presentation. I'm conscious there's a few questions in the chat and we are getting short on time. So we're going to move very quickly on to the last but not least presentation, which is from Ray Assis. Ray, we're very happy to have you with us. Ray is an activist and a migrants' rights advocate who moved to Hong Kong to work for the Asian Students Association and has been very involved, I know, with the migrant workers community, and is currently with the Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants, and he's program coordinator for advocacy and campaigns. And Ray, I believe you're going to talk about your chapter with Carlos on the ASEAN way in migration governance and maybe even migrant rights more generally. So the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaven. It's really good to be here. I'm very privileged to be part, to have contributed together with my colleague, Carlos Maningat from the Ecumenical Institute for Labor Education and Research, in doing this research as a contribution and being part of this wonderful book. Actually, I have been taking notes already, listening to all our speakers today, and I really hope that I will try my best to beat the time, or maybe even less than 10 minutes in my presentation. So I would like to share with you this research, this chapter that we want to look into understanding migration governance, specifically in Southeast Asia, especially with existing platform of governments in the subregion, which we call ASEAN. The ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a platform of 10 countries in the subregion with the purpose of, I quote, to accelerate economic growth, social progress, and cultural development in the region, and 2, to promote regional peace and stability through abiding respect for justice and the rule of law in the relationship among countries. So we really want to look into the migration governance in the ASEAN in relation to protecting human rights of migrant workers in this subregion. We know for a fact that migration patterns, particularly irregular migration, have led many governments in the region endeavoring to exert tighter control over cross-border movements through national policies and bilateral agreements, and by linking their security interests to the wider Asia-Pacific region. Looking into Southeast Asia, you would see here in the slide that there are the 10 countries, and we actually see that intra-regional migrants, according to the Economic and Social Commission in Asia Pacific of the UN, that intra-regional migrants comprise 92% of the migrant populace in the subregion. And in fact, majority of them are migrant workers and are low-skilled, or are considered low-skilled or semi-skilled workers. There's also information that female migrants coming from Southeast Asia and also within the subregion is close to 50%, which is usually higher than the global average. And in fact, human trafficking remains to be a major concern, especially maybe just to add that the recent cases of cyber trafficking within in the area, and then you see actually that Malaysia and Thailand being the 2 major destinations of more than 85% of the trafficking victims within the subregion. I will now go straight into how we see the migration governance, and we see that here the 2 fundamental features of ASEAN migration governance is that it's disengaged and decentralized. What do we mean by disengaged? It's disengaged in the process in terms of commitments, international commitments to migration and human rights, and secondly, decentralization of recruitment in the migration labor market. This approach usually places migrant workers, most especially those who are undocumented and vulnerable or precarious situation, while at the same time creating a space for contestations from below or from the communities. So what do you mean by disengage? When you say disengage, there are 3 factors that I would like to share here. Is 1, and that their commitments to international conventions vary. They vary according to governments. No, usually there are not all the governments in Southeast Asia are signatory to, for example, the 1990 United Nations Convention for Migrant Workers, for the rights of migrant workers and their families. I think there are only about 5 or 6 countries that have signed the UN protocol to prevent suppressions and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And in fact, the 1967 ASEAN founding document did not even touch on labor mobility. And it was only several years after, in 1995, that they actually included provisions on labor mobility, which was tackled under the 1995 Framework Agreement on Services. As you would see here, there is a reluctance on the part of Southeast Asian governments or countries to enter into these instruments, frameworks, or commitments on migration based on the principle of the ASEAN, one of the principles of the ASEAN, which is non-interference. So as you would see here, actually, in fact, a lot of the mechanisms and frameworks that have been that have come out of the ASEAN are non-legally binding. And you would see actually later on in the discussions around decentralization, or decentralization in terms of facilitating labor migration is how that also translates into that, or does not even translate. And so, in fact, we have in our chapter, we actually discussed the probably one of the many reasons in which this is actually put up there. Is that one of this I would like to share with you is the racial and cultural diversity within the ASEAN countries, and also combined with the weak, also the lack of stability of regime legitimacy within the ASEAN. Hence, the policy of non-interference is intended to prevent probable aggravation of conflicts among the different countries here. Many agreements, I would have to say, I'll share with you, is that it's focused on skilled labor and regular pathways, but do not include provisions for undocumented migrants. No, so it's usually a lot of bilateral labor agreements or memorandum of understanding are focused mostly on skilled labor. And so they're usually also focused on regular migration pathways. As you will see here, in decentralized issues here, we see that the relationships between governments as well as private recruitment agencies are actually very, very strong. This is what we call the middle space of migration. In fact, here you would see that a lot. You will see that a lot of the governments have actually relied on private recruitment agencies in facilitating labor migration. In fact, hiring, usually addressing the issues of looking into their entry, getting their health checks, placement, and even repatriation. This is actually placed on the hands of recruitment agencies, and in fact, they are the ones being able to. It's kind of like the regulation of labor migration, in which the private recruitment agencies right now have the power to actually dictate or determine how labor migrants will go. In fact, they have also looked into addressing also as a business, they're also responsive to the law of supply and demand. And as finally, they have a say in terms of like shaping the ideal migrant. In many, right, I am a migrant myself, but I'm not a migrant worker. But way back my time when I was in university, for example, I would think that my dream, for example, is to be a doctor, be a lawyer. But right now, the shaping of the ideal migrant, especially in Southeast Asia, is that many migrants right now, many young people right now, their main dreams of actually is to become a migrant worker. And this could be probably attributed to a lot of labor focus, migrant focused education institutions to divert their academic dreams into how do you call that, the demands of the labor market. And in fact, they are actually saying that the ideal migrant worker, and even providing the idea of the ideal maid, because as majority of migrant workers in Southeast Asia are usually migrant domestic workers. And so you could actually see here that they actually here seen migrant workers are seen as quality products, but not as people with migrant with rights. I will not be delving into the different countries here, but as you would see on the top layer, these are all migrant sending countries, and on below, Malaysia and Singapore, these are the migrant receiving countries. So if you would see here, in essence, a lot of the migrant sending countries are focusing on regulating the licensing of recruitment agencies, while for migrant receiving countries, they are regulating the inflow of low-skilled migrant labor. You would see here as well that there is a discriminatory, and within the regime of visas, for example, there is a difference between according rights, services, benefits to what we call skilled labor or expatriates, as opposed to those who are low-skilled workers. And so as you would see here, there we can actually see that there is definitely a big gap in terms of migration governance as in relation to protection of migrant workers' rights. In fact, like for example, in the Philippines, there are so many laws in terms of protecting migrant rights, but there is still a gap in terms of enforcing it. And so there's a big role of civil society in championing migrants' rights. This is a space in which a lot of civil society organizations, whether at the national, regional, or even at the global levels, are actually engaging in terms of calling for stronger regulation on recruitment agencies, provision of services to migrant workers, especially those in distress, accessing services, aid, and justice, and even allowing migrant workers to self-organize and practice their workers' rights to speak up, form associations, join unions, and engage in discussions or conversations, dialogues with the government in addressing and achieving their demands. And so I would like to close with this particular point that we want to include in this chapter is that the migrant workers are primary stakeholders in the migration ecosystem. You would actually see that a lot of migrant workers organizations in the region have been engaging with their respective host country governments as well as their sending country governments in addressing the gap or the loophole in terms of addressing the rights concerns of migrant workers as well, and even of their families that they have left behind and that they were forced to left behind because of the situation. And so I just really hope that there would be more within the ASEAN to actually create that space for migrant workers, organized or not, to participate in conversations that shape not only regular pathways, but also ensuring and upholding the rights of migrant workers and their families. Thank you very much, Evan.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Thank you for finishing on that really important point about migrants as being at the center of the ecosystem, because a lot of the policies and discussions, as you know, seem to somehow center the state perspectives and state's interest or the interests of capitalism in this discussion around migration. And I think your chapter, like many of the others in part 4 of the handbook, really highlight the gap between what is supposed to happen and what actually happens in practice, and then therefore this need for others to mobilize to try and organize around those spaces. So thank you so much for that contribution, a really important one, and for also bringing in the perspective of Southeast Asia. You pointed out in your presentation that 92% of the migration is within the region. And I think there's a question in the chat about the African context too, particularly in the context of the youth increase that's expected and is already the case in Africa. You know, more than 80%, I think, of migration in the African continent is within the continent. So in all of these debates that we're discussing in relation to South-South migration, the importance of understanding those regional perspectives, I think, is critical. So thank you all. We are running out of time. I'm very happy to see that we have some questions, but also that the authors of the chapters have answered the questions or tried to answer the questions. That's very helpful. I think probably we won't have time to have a comment from everybody who's spoken about everybody else's contributions, because that would probably take us into another half hour or so. But if there's anybody in particular from the panelists, from the authors that would like to make a comment, either in relation to a question in the chat or in relation to the other contributions, then now is your chance. You just need to put your camera on and I'll know that you want to do that. Jerichi, do you want to come in maybe on that question or more generally?
I would like to quickly reflect on the question on the youth demography in Africa and how it's playing out in migration processes and shaping the future trend. It is true. I mean, Africa is it's a very youthful continent, which could be as much an asset as it could also be a liability, depending on to what extent the economy could observe this youth labor. I mean, in Ethiopia alone, for instance, I mean, 70% of Ethiopians are under the age of 30 and 40% under the age of 15. And it's the second most populous country in Africa. And it is currently it's 125 million. And by 2050, it's projected to double its current population. So you can imagine the implication of that. And this is one of the reasons why the youth are on the move. And definitely this have policy implications, and perhaps just to mention a couple of policy related issues and what needs to be done. One would be, I think we need to put proper youth policies in order. But youth policies is not just simply ticking the box and then awareness and containment, but something which goes beyond in the direction of creating more viable local futures, and which is also situated within the wider job creation agenda. Also, it has implications on bilateral labor agreements, for instance. There is still a need for labor within the continent. People need to move around, but this could also be framed in the language of the wider schemes of regional integration. The AU and the REX are very much active in it's their mandate to promote regional integration, and perhaps this could also be an area where policy should focus. And if the Ethiopian government, for instance, is striking a deal with some Gulf countries towards bilateral labor agreements, but this could also be extended within the continent. Of course, last but not least, there is a need for family planning. It's with nearly 4+ children, the fertility rate in Ethiopia being 4+ children. And you can imagine what this really means, not just simply for migration, but one of the reasons why Ethiopia's high economic growth trajectory is not really translated into development is because whatever is achieved is really diluted. There are more than 2 million youth on the job market every year that the economy could not absorb it. And at the end of the day, somehow we need to get the family planning into place. Otherwise, there might be really a crisis. And this crisis could also play out or manifest itself in terms of fueling political violence. Those youth who are on the move, the others are not. Those who are staying might be susceptible or receptive to radical ideologies or views, because hope is cut, as we say in Ethiopia, in Amharic. And this new youth vulnerability could easily be mobilized for all kinds of radical projects.
Thank you, Darius. I think your response, but also the question in itself implicitly, it brings to mind this point, which I keep on making, and I know others do too, that migration policy is not just about migration, right? That's what's happened in the politics of migration, which have become so deeply pernicious and problematic, is that the focus has been on essentially the movement itself rather than the underlying factors, these huge transformations taking place in the countries where people are moving from and within, that explain and make sense of what's going on. That combined with this very particular form of global capitalism, which is spreading into regions and creating all sorts of new forms of working and new labor markets with very little regulation and very little rights, it seems to me. So yeah, I think one of the really important contributions of the handbook is that it situates migration within these broader processes of socio-political and economic change, and your contribution, of course, is one that does that precisely through looking at, for example, the investment decisions that what happens to that money as a part of that process. We've unfortunately run out of time, and I know that people have to go to other events and meetings, but I really wanted to conclude by just sort of saying again that I think the contributions they're all excellent, but they all really show a window into different parts of this process that are often neglected. I'm conscious that many of the other authors of the chapters are also online listening to this discussion, and all of the chapters, I think, really add another dimension to what's going on. For those of you that haven't yet received your hard copy, I have a blurred screen so you can't see it, but the size of this book is very, very significant, right? It is huge. And it is a huge contribution, I think, to the discussion, because it doesn't just make the case that South-South migration is important or large in scale, but rather that the nature of that migration intersects with these structural inequalities that we've been hearing about today. And that in turn, the solutions or the policy responses to those forms of migration need to be articulated and thought through in the same complex and nuanced way as the processes they try to address. So, and that narratives are also this kind of cross-cutting theme that shapes not only how and why people move, but also what happens to them when they do. So I'm really grateful to all of the contributors to the volume, not just the ones that have joined us today, but of course, particularly grateful to the ones that have joined us today for giving up their time. If you want to come on screen, you're very welcome, so we can see everybody and see the smorgasbord of delights that are contributors to the handbook. Thank you all so much, as I say, for your contribution. It feels somehow, though, this is a beginning rather than an end, which is slightly odd when you've got a publication of this nature. But I do hope that the book will lend itself to new collaborations, to ongoing and deepening collaborations within MIDEQ and beyond, and that this will continue to be a way of us connecting around some of these issues. So thank you. Thank you to the people in the background for organizing the event. Thank you to all of you for being here. And please download the handbook and encourage your libraries to buy it. I guess that's the final plug on behalf of Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you so much, and hope to stay connected, really. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.